Hello, and welcome to all the truth seekers that have joined us today from around the world. I'm glad that you've decided to join this online community. For the next hour, I want to help you uncover new ideas that will push you towards new thinking inside and outside of your business. My name is Mark McKelsey, and I lead the projects and the people that bring you education, trends, and next practices from Global Market Development Center. This Infocast aspires to make your lunch hour profitable by demonstrating just how the curiosity and the power of the consumer must be at the center of your strategy. In other words, the way you've done things in the past is no longer the way your future success will happen. Retailers and brands, more than ever, must be adaptive and in constant flux in order to connect with your customers. So, how you respond to this session will determine your success. And without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm coming to you live from Colorado Springs and have Mike Rogosa joining me today from Planet Retail in Boston. The title of this session is Auto-Replenishment and Subscriptions and How They Are Impacting the Future of Retail. Today's Infocast is going to help you find the so what behind the few years of disruption that all retailers have been experiencing with the influx of today's competitors that are fighting for space in the world of retailing. With the role of the store changing and departments undergoing dramatic transformations, the importance of understanding the shopper is paramount. With fewer and fewer trips needed for someone to enter the physical store while the world of virtual selling seems like it's eroding the share of wallet every day, the reinvention of retail is at stake. What once inspired retailers to alter their store layouts in the past is no longer working today. Many retailers I know and speak with lament, if we could start all over again, they say we would, but we can't. And we're faced with space issues, migration of products, and shrinking sales. So that means it's clear that it's time for retailers to reach and look far outside of the industry in order to reimagine what's next, in order to stay relevant and keep customers coming back. And it's more than just retailing. The infrastructure today of the buy-sell interaction is architecturally challenged to reflect the mindset of the contemporary consumer. Today's consumers indeed love adventure and have a natural propensity to discover things while they're outdoors, on vacation, and most importantly, today's Infocast about shopping. We can all agree that the invention of the smartphone has opened the consumer's mind and given them millions of options to make their lives easier. But if we look past the existence of that advice, the option mindset was made possible far before we were introduced to the microcomputer that fits in our back pocket. Indeed, it was the internet that forced the gateway of information and ushered us into the realm of anything is and everything is possible for the customer. The unending wealth of information available has inspired our imaginations and made us see the world through a completely new lens. So before this, we as customers were otherwise at the mercy of what brands, marketers, and other authorities told us to do and buy. In fact, it was the superhighway of information that set the experience and the shopping of economy ablaze, but we didn't know it at the time. So with that said, welcome, Mike. Would you help our viewers know more about what they can expect to learn today?
Absolutely, Mark, and thanks for having me again this afternoon. Today's session about auto-replenishment subscriptions is going to focus on an understanding of whether this model, this auto-replenishment type of model, will eventually become the center store of the future. We know there's a lot of erosion already towards online, but they tend to be more one-off purchases. As auto-replenishment takes more and more share overall, there's a question that says, will they take an exponentially greater share of center store space away? And especially, how long until we get there? So during today's session, we're going to dive into a couple of those questions, including looking at some of the technologies that are going to enable this transformation, with the ultimate end goal of understanding best-in-class practices today and how they'll eventually shape the future.
Sounds great. I'm looking forward to it, Mike. Back to our viewers, before we get started and then dive in, I'd like to remind you that we'll take questions during or after the session by using the Q&A button at the top of your screen. We'll get to those at the end of the hour. So let's get started. Back over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with everybody. And as I'm doing that, I wanted to just reiterate that today's session, while the focus is on auto-replenishment and subscriptions, this is one small part of the wider retail trend that we're seeing both towards e-commerce in general, but also we'll talk a lot today about the trend towards recommendations. We as shoppers are getting very used to and starting to accelerate our desire to be told what we will like. That's being driven by not only subscription-based product companies, but you see a lot of this evolution happening as well with companies like Netflix, like Amazon, from an entertainment standpoint, where if you just think about your video habits, your music habits, a lot of it is built now on that little section that says shows or music you might like. So behind all of these trends that we're going to talk about today is sort of an overarching move from a shopper standpoint into shoppers being 100% in control and choosing individually what they will like, to a softening up and a recognition that in order to save time or convenience or prompt an area of discovery, we are more willing to give up information, to change over our choices to somebody, whether it be a program, a company, a person, that as long as they're giving things and as long as their recommendations prove worthwhile, we're happy to keep giving away that information. And so with that as the backdrop, this session today about auto-replenishment and subscriptions is really one subset of a broader trend towards curation and recommendation-driven shopping that we're seeing really starting to take hold in retail today, and will be very prevalent not just for e-commerce companies, but increasingly store-based companies as well. As a reminder, before we jump into today's presentation, we have been partners with GMDC for a number of years now, and all of you joining today as members, you will have access to our entire store photo database on retailnetgroup.com. So you can keep track of these changes and how they're showing up within the store of the future. Right on the website, you'll see all the latest store formats, videoed or photographed there and held there. So anything from the latest Amazon Go store to new Walmart formats that are getting developed. So as we talk about this shift towards auto replenishment and subscriptions and what it'll eventually mean to the physical store format, one of the big partnerships that Planet Retail RNG has with GMDC is still the ability to log in and view those changes live. Now, for those of you that are familiar with our company and have seen one of our presentations before, you know that when we are looking at the retail of the future, we're really going and trying to understand across a few key areas. And this is true across our entire company. So whether you're on our website, retailnetgroup.com, or whether you are seeing any of our presentations, you'll see this framework carried throughout the entire methodology of how we look at the world. And we do this because if you want to understand how not just the retail industry is changing, but let's say any industry that you might be sitting in is changing, you cannot look internally only. You have to look externally. You have to understand what's happening from a societal or shopper standpoint, what's happening from technologies, what's happening within the economy, whether people have more money to spend, spending it the same way. All of these external drivers really do make a big difference ultimately in who the winners and losers are going to be within your industry. And I think Mark said it well right in the opening. When you talk about the changes that we're seeing in retail today, especially driven by technology advances and the expectation of convenience, anything I want, anytime I want, it didn't start with products. It started with information, and that was just the growth of the internet and the idea that with a click of a button, I can find out anything that I want. So that naturally evolved into, why can't I get anything that I want anytime, anywhere? And ultimately what we've seen that do is transition and completely uproot retail to the point today when you look at the majority of new innovation and new growth within retail, the majority of new companies are starting obviously not with store-based formats, but through e-commerce formats. And we just continue to see a steady growth of e-commerce taking share from store-based retail here in the US. Right now, we're sitting at about 16% across all categories. And that's going to continue to grow and will actually pick up growth over the course of the next few years across individual categories, because not of a technology change this time, but because of a very impactful societal change. And once again, for those of you that have joined us on these Infocasts before, you will have heard us say this: e-commerce growth is about to accelerate, because for the first time over these next few years, the majority of millennials will go through the ages of marriage, first home buying, and first children. Those latter two, first household purchase and first child, are the two major drivers of retail spend in a consumer's lifetime. And millennials have been putting them off for 6 to 7 years longer than any generation before them, which is why you see some of this shift towards experiences and some of these other retail behaviors, because they have a little bit more of that disposable income when you're not putting so much into a house purchase in your early 20s or having a first child in your early 20s. But now, it's not to say no millennials have reached that age, but over the next few years, the majority will move through that time period, which will trigger huge amounts of increase in e-commerce spend as they shop for new categories and shop for a household purchase for the first time in their lives. Now, what we recognize within this trend is that not every category is impacted equally. When we look at that e-commerce share and what's driving so much of it, you have obviously categories that moved early, whether that be electronics or office supplies. You've really seen a lot of evolution within the categories themselves and their movement and the pace of movement into the e-commerce space. And grocery historically has been the laggard category. If we look back just a couple years ago, and even today, grocery still in the low single digits of share, but is now starting to pick up as one of the fastest growing categories. And so the big evolution and the big topic that we will discuss here today is, what does this chart look like specifically for auto replenishment? Because the shift online is not equal across categories, and neither is the relevance for auto replenishment and subscription programs. But the reason that we set it up with sort of the overall shift towards e-commerce at the beginning is because as millennials enter into buying a home for the first time, buying for a household and a family for the first time, these are shoppers who have, for the last 6 or 7 years, many of them, the ones who control the vast majority of spending power among the generation, have lived in urban areas and have done a disproportionate share of their shopping through e-commerce methods. And we would expect that environment to continue. Just because they move to the suburbs doesn't mean they will have forgotten the convenience of having something just dropped off and delivered to your home. And now that they are engaging in more categories that tend to lend themselves to auto replenishment, which we'll talk about those attributes later on, we see an environment very clearly where a lot of these items in that center store mode, across health and beauty care, across household care and cleaning, across a lot of our center store staple goods, can make that transition to online. Now, the big question that we get all the time, which is not the focus for today's presentation, but we have gone into great detail on this on previous GMDC webinars about experiential retail, digital integration. The big question is, if all of this space is getting pressured within the store, if these categories are shifting out of the store, what's going into it. Because as Mark said, many retailers today are saying, if we could start over, of course we would. We don't need as much space as we have in the US market right now, which is why if you look and stay on top of developments from other countries, whether that be China, India, Mexico, markets whose e-commerce development is growing alongside the evolution of store-based chain retail, you'll notice a few core things. One, the stores are nowhere near as big. They have a lot less square footage because you don't need as much space in a world where some of the products lend themselves more towards e-commerce replenishment. Secondly, the stores are much more focused on services, especially food service from a grocery standpoint, and they're much more focused on social aspects, a lot more space dedicated towards the perimeter sections that carry more elements of discovery and pleasure in the ways that you shop them. You're not just going in to find and grab a product. The perimeter aisles generally are where you do a little bit more discovery, where you aren't sure what you might be making for dinner that night, or you might want to see what the latest recommended wine or what the latest recommended options from the chef are. And those types of elements are now showing up more and more in the traditional stores that we have here in the US. As more of these products shift online, we're now starting to see much more of a shift of that space away from center store and away from traditional aisles into a few core areas that you can see here on the slide. First one is services, and to a large extent, health services. They are growing a disproportionate share of space as other categories leave the store. So health services, food services, and the big one that we haven't talked about yet, but will be a mainstay of this presentation as well, click and collect or fulfillment services. If anybody's been in a Whole Foods since the Amazon acquisition, you can see the differences that they've made in their space allocations, where there used to be a large amount of space dedicated towards shopper sampling and brand discovery areas. They even had some alternative experiences like spas and otherwise. To a large extent, all of that space has been removed. And where Prime Now shopping is available in that city, you've seen a complete rededication of that space towards fulfillment. And you'll continue to see that from the likes of retailers of Walmart to Kroger to Target, all of these retailers making significant investments in their click and collect and fulfilled from store or ship from store capabilities. You won't see as much dedicated area from the discounters or from some of these partners who are just using third-party players like Instacart in order to fulfill stores. But from all of the big retailers, this is the #1 area of investment and redistribution of space, is towards these click and collect and fulfillment areas, or towards these new health services and services in general. We already talked about, sort of secondly, the growth of the perimeter section of the store. So whether that be the specialty cheese shop within Kroger's, or you look at the growth of bakeries, you look at the growth of the wine sections across so many of these stores, you're seeing an encroaching amount of space that's focused on more of those experiential elements take space away as more of those center store products shift online. And the last thing that we have seen more towards those center store aisles, they're not staying the same either. So while their space may be shrinking, there's also a complete reimagination of what a center store experience will look like. And there's a great example from Target in partnership with Hershey to reimagine the center store candy aisle to make it a destination and more of an experiential and discovery trip versus just one of the 13 aisles that you walk up and down, filling your shopping list and grabbing generally a replenished item that you're using to stock up on your pantry. So you're seeing a lot of the retailers shift both the space allocation and also the way that their traditional space is laid out in an effort to reimagine and evolve in this experience where a lot of their categories and a lot of their space is not as productive as it used to be. As I mentioned, we covered a lot more in depth and a lot more of these type of examples during previous GMDC webinars on experiential retail, digital integration, and those are all recorded for GMDC members, and you can go back and access those presentations following today's session if you missed those ones. But what we're here to talk about today, and what we'll spend the majority of the rest of the session talking about, is that evolution towards e-commerce is not evenly distributed. As we said, you have what we're calling on the spectrum prompted shopping trips towards unprompted shopping trips. And when we talk about auto-replenishment and the focus of today's presentation, we're going to be focusing a lot on the unprompted delivery of an item. Prompted purchases, you can treat those as the very typical ones that we're engaging with. I think of something, I need it, I go online and I fill in, add something to my cart and hit checkout. Now, there's certainly been evolution in prompted buying. We're seeing some significant evolutions in it, and we'll see significant evolutions in it over the next few years. You can see dash buttons as sort of a beginning trial of what we will eventually get to with voice-based shopping. But there's a whole bunch of innovation that's coming with prompted shopping. I think about this, I want it, whether I still have to go online and purchase it or whether I'm now just saying, Alexa, order me X item. We are not calling that auto-replenishment or a subscription. If you are actively saying, purchase me another one of these, we count those as prompted trips. And like I said, there's certainly been evolution, whether those be dash buttons, whether it be voice-based shopping, of which I'm sure some of you may have seen a couple weeks ago. There was a very prominent article that showed voice-based shopping has been slow to get adopted. We see that as a very minor bump in the road. I think the adoption of voice technology is still well outpacing what people thought it would be. And shopping is just a lagging indicator and a lagging trend to the overall way that we engage with voice-based AI. So I think you will see a whole lot of interaction with voice moving forward. But as I said, today's presentation is really going to focus on the shift that we are going to see for prompted trips, especially through center store items. So think about your toilet papers, think about your shampoo, think about your toothpaste, think about some of those basic household staple goods that right now you might do a prompted trip, and even a voice-based prompted trip, you're running low on paper towels. Alexa, order me more paper towels. The evolution that we expect to see, and that we've already started to see pretty dramatically across certain categories, is a shift from you ever having to say, even Alexa, order me more paper towels, to an environment where in the long term, the paper towel dispenser will know that it's running low and just automatically reorder. So when we're talking about smart auto replenishment, when we're talking about scheduled subscription purchases, those unprompted, set it up once, and now it is just a recurring purchase, that's what we mean when we are talking about auto replenishment and subscriptions. And we talked a little bit about this already, but what's driving this shift, even from prompted trips to unprompted trips, is still this demand for convenience, this overwhelming desire and necessity and changing shopper sort of preference, or changing shopper desire for, even in some cases above price, to get a convenient and immediate and frictionless experience. That is the overriding trend in retail right now, is what are the ways to unlock, find a customer pain point and just tear it down. And that is what we are seeing across so many of these shopper trends. Somebody who is demanding convenience and flexibility, somebody who is living, as we said, in urban areas longer, in smaller houses longer in their life, waiting longer to have children, which eventually means you don't need as big a house if you don't have as many bedrooms. All of this sort of rolls on itself to say we might not need as many items in our pantry as we used to be, or as we used to. And an environment where I don't necessarily even have the storage space for a lot of these items, having an on-demand type of a model where, just like for all you manufacturers on the phone, just like the retailers are pushing back on manufacturers to carry less inventory, the shopper is basically saying the same thing. We don't need as much inventory. The technology and the ability that you manufacturers and you retailers are giving us to basically operate our life on a just-in-time model that traditionally was there for retailers and manufacturers' inventory, you're now seeing the same thing evolve into the way that a shopper might manage their household. They'll keep certain items still on inventory and have backups, but a large part of that space will shift away from these super large, 20 cans of tuna fish, 30 bags full of toilet paper and paper towels. You're seeing a lot of those staple goods that used to be purchased in bulk start to narrow down and operate more on this immediacy, on time, or just in time type of a model that's all built on the shopper driven preference for convenience. Now, there's also some technologies that are enabling this trend. So it's not entirely driven purely by a shopper desire for this. It's also enabled. We are at a point where this technology can actually enable this on a mass scale. And we talked a lot up at the front about voice technology, and that tends to be the one that's getting more notoriety right now for even shopping purchases. But we still see voice technology as more impactful for prompted purchases. It'll certainly play a role in auto-replenishment, using Alexa to set up a recurring purchase. But when you look at the technology that is truly going to differentiate auto-replenishment models of the future, we don't see that as voice technology. We see that as what's called the Internet of Things, the ability or just the sensory environment for something from, ones that exist today. Think about your Keurig dispensers, or think about even your printer, the ability to know that you are low on something, and without ever asking, do you want me to order more of this, or shoppers needing to say, order more of this, the device itself knows that it's running low and just orders the item without any shopper involvement at all. Now, there might be shopper involvement at the very beginning to say, follow this protocol, and when I hit this point, reorder me some. But after that, it is just a recurring, completely robotic and sensory-driven experience where all the shopper does is pick up the item on its front door. So when we look at what's really going to drive the future of auto-replenishment models and subscription-based services, voice technology will play a role in that, and voice technology is the sort of hot technology of today. It's the one that has, as I said, adopted so much faster than even what the experts predicted, even what, if you look at Amazon statements, even what they predicted internally. And you now see a shift from Alexa-based voice to where Google just surpassed Alexa as the dominant voice technology globally. You're seeing a lot more investment in this area. Eventually, voice technology will make its way out of a held device like an Echo or a Google Home, and it will just be embedded in those same devices. So your refrigerator will automatically be able to know you're running low on cheese or milk, and it will be able to talk to you as well. All of these technologies will eventually merge into the devices that we use ourselves, with the big benefit towards auto-replenishment being completely unprompted ordering. Now, when we talk about auto-replenishment, we split that into two sides. And I'd mentioned at the beginning, auto-replenishment and subscription services. If we just drop the word subscription services and just treat auto replenishment as the parent sort of phrase, it really then breaks down into two components: convenience-based replenishment or inspiration-based replenishment. Inspiration-based is the one that you typically hear more about with subscriptions. Those will be your Birchbox examples that we'll talk about. But generally, when we're talking about this future landscape that we're going into, we're talking about an environment that is driven by the convenience of, I know I need this item, I know I need it on this frequency, and it should just come to me. I shouldn't have to do anything. I should never, ever run out of an item that I use every day, ever again. So you think about those types of items, huge implications for especially categories like vitamins and supplements, things that you are meant to take on a specific schedule, just very easy replenishment. And we talked about shoppers wanting to operate more of that just-in-time model, not wanting to carry so much inventory, especially as they're living in some of these urban areas and smaller houses longer in their life. The ability to have some of these smaller, just what I want type of quantities, these eaches types of quantities, is a much more convenient experience for a shopper. And generally, retailers and brands are willing to pay shoppers to lock them into this type of a model, because obviously from the retailer or brand standpoint, having that captive audience is really where you want to be. The biggest impact for those convenience-based orderings, those are on your stock-up trips, as we mentioned, but it's also on those convenience trips, because the whole idea is you never run out of an item again. So having that immediacy of, oops, I just ran out, I need to go run to my convenience store, my drugstore, whatever proximity retailer is there, who generally is stocking these items at a premium price because of the immediacy at which shoppers need them. They'll start to see a bigger impact on those everyday staple essentials moving forward as more of this purchase shifts towards auto replenishment. On the flip side of that convenience-based experience, you have the inspiration. As Mark said at the beginning, this goal of the shopper of the future to have this experiential environment, to discover new things, to spend their money less on for things they buy every day or things that are considered staples. We're actually seeing more and more of a willingness to trade down and still be more price conscious. But for those categories where they want to be delighted, where there's an emotional connection, that's where the premiumization is really starting to take hold. And outside of just premiumization, the discovery elements are really starting to take hold. So inspiration-based auto replenishment is all about generally subscription boxes filled with samples. So I mentioned Birchbox, and beauty is a very relevant one, but you also see the same thing from food and beverage companies that we'll talk about in a minute. You see the same thing if you're thinking about flowers of the month, meats of the month, all of these type of subscription programs that are meant to just inspire and treat you to something new on a given type of schedule. The biggest impact in terms of shopping channels that we see for those inspiration-based ones, those are more on the experiential shopping trip. It's more in those categories that are also trying to compete with experience in store. But as we'll talk about towards as the end of today's presentation, auto replenishment right now basically only sits online. You will not see that be the case in the future. Why I can't be walking through an experiential shopping trip in a physical store and have that same option to say, let's get this item on auto replenishment, or let's sign up for a subscription box using maybe voice technology just in the shelf of a store. Those types of interactions will become much more common as we move forward into the future. But as we continue to talk about these splits, as we continue to understand how these type of environments are showing up between convenience and inspiration, when you think about what categories fall into convenience, it's those low involvement, need-based, very item-driven, recurring purchases. We'll talk about some of those examples in a minute, but it's the ones where you don't have a lot of emotion behind the purchase. It's a very need-based trip. I ran out of this. I buy this item every single time. I just want this item to still keep coming. And it doesn't necessarily need to be an item that you don't care about. To the point, pet food is a fantastic example for a convenience-based replenishment. Even though pet food is a highly considered purchase, once you do that initial phase of consideration, you just want that same one over and over. So even though we say low involvement, it's a low involvement recurring purchase. It can be a very high involvement first time purchase and a high consideration first time purchase. But after that, you've done all this work and now you just want the reward of getting that one over and over and over again. Whereas on the inspiration side, you're really looking at a category that is experiential, a category that is a want-based trip, something that you're spending your discretionary income on, and something that is really driven, like we'll talk about, a lot on samples and discovery and trial, which harkens back to that first message that I said here at the beginning of today's presentation, that auto-replenishment and subscriptions are part of a wider consumer trend towards recommendation and curated driven experiences. And why do we want that? Why do we want recommendations and curation? Because even when we want inspiration, we still want convenience. We don't want to look through a million different things and necessarily find the one that we want. There's a reason Walmart launched their Jet Black personal shopper service. There's a reason that Nordstrom is investing so much in their inventory-free stores, which is really just a personal shopper experience. We are becoming so much more comfortable, even in those inspirational categories, at being told what we will like. And as long as that experience continues to hold true, as long as that personal shopper or technology continues to delight us in the way that we want, that is a huge benefit on the convenience side of inspiration. And so as we start to put categories aligned around this type of an environment, as we start to see who fits in where, you can see that there isn't just one side of the model to a lot of the categories. There are categories that certainly fit in the middle. So on the convenience side, as I mentioned, you have recurring purchases, even high penetration or high consideration purchases like pet food. We mentioned vitamins and supplements, something that you need to take every day that you're going to run out of on a frequent type of schedule. Those are the items that really drive towards the convenience-driven mission. On the inspiration side, it's those items that we said are want-based, are ones that you would go and shop for, not even necessarily because you want to buy something, you're just browsing. So any of those types of aisles that you would walk up and down just to browse, just for fun, those are the ones that lends themselves very well towards inspiration. So obviously apparel and accessories. Think about things like Trunk Club, Stitch Fix, which we'll talk about in a minute. You think about, on the flip side of pet food, pet accessories. So a category where you have a high emotional connection, it's basically a gifting category because you care that much about your pet. You're just looking for ways and looking for new toys, and consumer electronics, same thing. There's a reason that even as Best Buy has struggled a little bit to get people to come to their physical stores, the Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas continues to get record attendance every year. Technology is always one of those categories where it's new, it's different. And if you have a shopper who is one of these early adopters, they're always going to have an environment where they want to discover what the latest tech is. They want to be a beta tester. And then you have those categories that sit in the middle. You have some of your beauty and cosmetics, great example. Birchbox is meant for discovery. It's meant to find new things that you might like that you might not try every day. It's meant to be trend-driven, changing, stay up to date with what's going on in the world and the latest fashion or beauty accessories. But at the same time, there are core beauty products that you use every day or on a set schedule, whether that be foundation or whether it be some of those types of basic beauty items that once you find one that you like, people are fiercely loyal and they generally use them on a known schedule and will just want to reorder and recur that type of same item. Food and beverage is one that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get into the meal kit environments, but that plays on both sides. You have people who don't really want to engage in shopping and figuring out what to eat for dinner. And then you have people who are doing meal kits because they want to try something new. They want to discover. They want to be involved in the latest food trends. So when you think about the categories that play into these, we focused a lot on the convenience side as it stands for the redistribution of space in the center store. But there's a whole side of inspiration across many of these categories that will really change how we engage with them. And when we think about the timeline or the potential for these items to shift to an auto-replenishment type of model, there are categories: household care and cleaning, personal care, office and school supplies. Those types of purchases, when you think about ink and toner from the office and school supply side, there's a high degree of recurrence across those categories where we could see as much as 75% of those types of items shift to auto-replenishment. And we're still, decades plus away, decade and a half away from getting to, this end state of auto-replenishment. But I mentioned at the beginning, e-commerce overall is going to grow as millennials shift into buying first house and buying for a family for the first time. There's also going to be a whole new generation that shifts into auto-replenishment type of models. And so we expect to see an exponential bump in the next few years for auto-replenishment programs. And household care and cleaning and personal care will be at the forefront of those auto-replenishment driven purchases. So when you think about the timeline and the degree at which these categories will shift, just like when we looked at that first image and the splits around how much of that total category is online today, there's a very big dichotomy between what categories will lend and shift a large portion of their spend, even in store-based spend, into this auto-replenishment type of model. And it does cater a lot more towards those center store type of items than it does even those inspiration type of items that we were talking about. This also is a trend that is not just driven by the brands themselves, but is also retailer-led replenishment. You have both sides really trying to lock in the shopper into these models where brands continue to try and figure out what is the right way for me to go direct to consumer. And it's no surprise that some of the best models have been, as we said, these personal care items, these household items. We've seen very high success rates for some of the categories like shaving and personal care to get a shopper into some of these subscription-based programs. And retailers the same way. Retailers have focused more on the household goods, the pantry stock-ups, whether it be Amazon, whether it be Target that we'll talk about in a minute. You continue to see both sides really go after the shopper in this case, and both with the same goal of locking in that shopper into a subscription method, into a sort of locked and set environment, because the switching costs to get for a competitor to break you out of this habit is just astronomically high. And the data that you can learn about a shopper from engaging in these programs is incredibly lucrative for both the brands and the retailers, and the reason why we see both playing such a prominent role in guiding shoppers in this direction. Now, when we talk about best-in-class examples, and when we talk about splitting out what we see as the current landscape between convenience and inspiration, we see these kind of in two phases. For convenience, right now, there is the mainstay setup of scheduled auto-replenishment. That's what we talked about at the beginning for some of those items that we see just as recurring purchases. I set it up once and it comes to me on a known time frame. So those are things like Harry's Razor subscriptions, something that you set up once and then it's sending to you same day each time during a month. If you're away that month, you put it on hold. It comes to you on that familiar schedule. Same thing from the retailer side, target, subscribe, and save. You choose the items, you set your schedule, and then that shows up on your front door at that particular time period on that recurring basis. Now, the problem with this one, and what we've seen why people cancel these type of subscriptions, is timeframes can change. Your schedule can change. You don't want to get locked in to having to stick to a same schedule. Now, for items like shaving necessarily, or vitamins, especially as we mentioned, something pet food that you know you are going to use absolutely every single day, those ones really fit well in this type of a model. But if you think about other household items that we mentioned, like paper towels, some weeks you might have a lot more spills than other weeks. And if an item builds up on your recurring schedule, then yes, you could adjust it. But oftentimes we're seeing people cancel those types of subscriptions because it's not providing them with the convenience of having less stock sitting and less inventory sitting in their own house. So the long-term future that we really see with an auto-replenishment, why we're so bullish on long-term Internet of Things and what it can do for auto-replenishment, is these predictive models. The flip of the switch from I need to set a schedule into the item or the technology itself is smart enough to know that I am running low, and then it auto orders me a new one. You're seeing this happen right now. There's a boxed concierge service where you can set it up. And right now it's mainly for B2B, but it's making its way a little bit into the B2C world as well. And it is a service built on the back of AI and some of their technology on the back end. This isn't built on smart sensors in your house. This is built on the technology knowing your habits and prompting you with reorders on a schedule that it thinks it's right for you. The flip side of that is the actual Internet of Things evolution, like we see with Amazon Dash Replenishment, where we've actually seen partnerships between Amazon and WePlenish. And these are items, whether in this case we're talking about Nespresso pods or Keurig pods, the technology or the item itself, the coffee maker, or in the case of going back to a printer, the hardware senses when it's running low, and that's when the replenishment gets scheduled. That is the long-term future of convenience-based auto replenishment. The technologies themselves, whether it be refrigerators, whether it be printers, whether it be, in this case, coffee pods, you are going to continue to see sensor evolution within the actual devices themselves to enable a replenishment type of environment. And we're still a little ways away from that becoming mainstream, but more and more as voice technology makes this migration into the individual devices, you'll continue to see this replenishment evolution as well. On the flip side, related to inspiration, we see two basic tenets and two basic sort of attributes of the inspiration-based trip. Curated versus personalized. Curated meaning the retailer is doing all the choice for you. Best example there is meal kits. You don't have any sort of say over what is included in this meal. You are really just engaging in it because you want to try something new for dinner, whether it be because you don't want to cook and it's a little bit more convenient, or because you're really engaging on the discovery side and you're using HelloFresh, or you're using Blue Apron, or you're using Plated as a way to discover and stay on top of new trends, new foods that you might want to eat. You're using it to discover, but you have absolutely no say over what items go into that box. Same thing with, in this case, Amazon's Prime Book Box. It's the same thing that we see with, as we mentioned, electronic purchases. It's really just meant to be recommendation driven by the retailer or by the brand to say, you might like this. We're curating this because we think this is on trend and we think this is what will give you a good sense of inspiration and a good sense of new discovery. And we're just going to send you this new one, the same one to absolutely everybody. And that type of environment is hugely beneficial for the retailer side because it allows them to optimize their supply chain, and it doesn't disrupt the shopper benefit or the shopper desire for that inspiration and discovery in the first place. But then on the other side of the spectrum from that curated experience, you have the personalized options. And this is where you get into more of the apparel companies and the beauty companies, where the AI and data-driven technologies are using personal attributes about yourself, which generally requires upfront screenings and upfront engagement from the shopper to describe what they enjoy, what they're looking for, and then it narrows down the choices but becomes a much more personalized experience versus the curated environment of same thing to everybody. So these ones work really well. Obviously, Stitch Fix has been a growing company for a number of years now. We're seeing a huge shift towards personal shopping at scale in the apparel business, to the point where, in my personal opinion, I think in an environment within the next decade, we're going to see a huge amount of growth. And even everyday shoppers, normally personal shopping is something that you would consider for the rich, something that you consider a luxury type of engagement. You're going to see that type of environment come way down to a normal shopper. An average consumer may have a personal shopper. Now, it might not be a person, it might be a robot, but from an apparel standpoint and from some of these emotional type of categories, they want to be recommended to, they're willing to pay for that type of a subscription. That will become much more mainstream versus the luxury tier that it's in right now. And just mentioning Birchbox for a second, I have this example in here actually to demonstrate a negative aspect of the subscription program right now. We've already talked about the good aspects of a Birchbox type of program, but the downside of these categories and these types of subscription programs for the inspiration side is sending too many items and too frequently. Birchbox has a huge churn rate because even the 4 items that they're sending, the 4 small sample sizes coming on a once-a-month basis, that's too much for a lot of shoppers. So you have this challenge from a brand and a retailer standpoint to really understand the timeline that a shopper wants to engage with this. And even on an inspiration front, you can't upset the convenience side that says, I don't want to carry a lot of the inventory. If I have 2 or 3 Birchboxes just piling up in my closet, and they're trial sample sizes, so I might like an item, I might not. Even if it's an item that I do like, it might not be an item that I use every day. So there's a big opportunity for some of these subscription boxes to pile up, which upsets the overall mission of convenience that overrides everything, and is a big consideration when you go the auto-replenishment route. Even if you're looking for inspiration, you cannot upset convenience, which is the #1 driver of pretty much all shopper behavior these days. So before we open it up for questions, just getting everybody back and really summarizing what we took away from today's presentation. Big themes related to auto replenishment and subscriptions. #1 thing, we are at the very beginning. We are at the beginning and tipping point for some of this e-commerce growth and some of the auto replenishment growth that we expect to see. And it's being driven somewhat by shopper trends and those millennials really starting to engage in heightened sense of convenience, along with the technologies, these connected products and sensor products that will be built into some of our devices that enables more of this prompted delivery. Second big takeaway is that when you look at the auto replenishment programs, and if you guys are considering engaging with these, or you're trying to understand what spots in the store might be more at risk, there's two sides. The low involvement categories are going to be what's much more heavily impacted in terms of space and share of sales that move into these. And they're also going to be the first to move. And when I say low involvement categories, that doesn't mean non-consideration. So we come back to that pet food example. It can be high consideration the first time, but it's low involvement recurring purchases. What are those items that you buy the same one of every single time? Experiential categories right now are still those discovery type of programs. They're still targeted towards higher incomes. We'll start to see that come down and become more mainstream, but it'll be 5+ years into the future. And the last one, the overarching takeaway, the overarching theme that I wanted everybody to take away from this presentation, that auto-replenishment is just one manifestation of a larger trend of shoppers turning over more control of what they buy to outside recommendations. And what I mean by that is, you look at Amazon and you look at the Amazon recommends flag that got launched last year. You look at not just product-based purchases, but you look at companies like Netflix telling you you might like this based on your previous behavior. We are getting much more comfortable in the realm of convenience, in that goal of, yes, I might want to try new things, but hey, it's so much easier to try a new thing if I don't have to think about what that is. To bring it back to a personal level, who hasn't sat there on a beautiful sort of Saturday morning in the summertime and you're just saying, what should I do today? There's just so much of our lives that is still prone to recommendations and convenience that could direct us to a certain, in this case, product, that we're going to continue to see more and more of that, either on a personal shopping front or on these auto-replenishment programs. And so what that means towards brands and retailers and everybody considering what the future of auto-replenishment looks like, number one thing when you are considering the auto-replenishment environment of the future, the switching costs once you get locked into an auto-replenishment program are astronomical. You thought the environment of trying to convert people, you used to have shelf space, you used to be able to do, side-by-sides and brand boxing and all of these things, all of these strategies that you could do on the shelf. And then that moved to an online e-commerce environment where your space got shrunk ridiculously, and it really became, how do I win on search? Because search was your digital storefront. You now carry that environment one more into the future, and whether it be voice technology where there is no shelf, or if you're looking at just locking people in to the product, the actual hardware, choosing that replenishment for them, to try to disrupt that environment, you're going to see a lot more brands have to go, even if you're buying a competitor's product, trying to include trial packs and trying to disrupt the overall flow of an auto-replenishment program, which is extremely, extremely costly. From the brand who's actually did win that first auto-replenishment setup, there's also a challenge for them of, it's great that I have locked in volume. It's great that I can optimize my supply chain now to reach this shopper at this date every single time. But how do I get growth out of that? You see, or you will see, retailers, even the ones, if you look at Harry's as a great example, not only is it razor blades, but you see a lot of trial packs and a lot of trade up promotions to things like shaving gels, things like other grooming products. So once you get them locked into your program, it then becomes, how do I widen out the basket size of what they purchase from me? Obviously, AI and the investment in technology is a huge, huge investment for everybody within this space, because I mentioned shoppers turning over more control to those recommendation engines. That only stays if your recommendation engines are good. You do not get many chances to mess up, because again, it all comes back to convenience. If you're not providing me with things that I like, or if it's a disruptive trip, you don't get many chances in this environment. Shoppers are so willing to switch and change their allegiances if something's not working, that to have good AI and to have good technology as a core backdrop for this future. And ultimately, when we're talking about this shift towards these outside recommendations, there may be an overarching need where you are no longer trying to influence the shopper individually. As a brand, you might trying to be influencing the retailer or the recommendation engine that is just telling the shopper what to buy. So there's a real shift in the points of influence as the shopper gives up more control, and understanding now it's not necessarily about winning the digital shelf in terms of what that shopper sees. It's how do I do everything possible to become that Amazon choice type of an item and get that flag, which is an algorithm type of a decision, not a marketing and consumer influence type of a decision. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining here this afternoon. I know we are tight on time for questions, but as I mentioned, I'm happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that came up during the course of the presentation.
Well, thanks, Mike. We do have a few questions that have come in from our viewers. I think the first one, you had mentioned a URL at the very beginning of your presentation. Would you be able to repeat that? We've had a few requests come through. I've sent out the store tours link on the GMDC website, but you may be referencing something different.
That was exactly what it was, Mark. So our direct URL is retailnetgroup.com, but the best way for all GMDC members to access it, there's actually a dedicated landing page for the store tours that are available to all GMDC members. And that's this exact link that Mark has shared with everybody today.
Good. We've got a question here. I'm just going to go ahead and try to shorten it or reinterpret it. As we see, and I'm assuming supplier manufacturer companies offering products on their own .com sites, how do you expect this to impact the kind of subscription services that you're talking about today, Mike?
So the question of D2C and the question of brands offering those subscriptions directly is one that basically every single supplier that we work with is trying to get a better grasp on. But to a large extent, it's not as a sales channel. It's not going to have a material impact on the sales dollars necessarily. Now, there are a few that will. Gillette's program in response to Harry's, which was obviously acquired by Unilever. You have some of these programs that are having a direct impact on the retailers and the store base themselves. But the vast majority of brand direct-to-consumer activity is going to be about data collection and new product launches and really an engagement touch point more so than a sales channel. So we still see the vast majority of categories moving through aggregate platforms like a retailer, whether that be online or in the store. And there are very few categories whose direct subscription program is going to generate enough traffic to offset or disrupt from a sales environment, but pretty much everybody is going to engage in it from a data collection and marketing perspective. So when we lay that back out, it's just another sort of niche off of the growth that retailers today can actually expect. And it's another sort of hurdle to get at as they look for growth.
We have another question that's come through, and I can help answer some of this. What will happen to the space in the store that will transition these auto-replenishment models? I know through the GMDC's retail focus group, this is a very hot topic. In fact, we've been asked as an association to say, what type of services would GMDC recommend that retailers replace, since we have so much aisle shrinkage that's going on right now and a lot of category leakage to online? What do they do with that space? Well, one, it depends on the localized shopper, who your shopper is, what channel that you're servicing. I know something like a Walgreens or a CVS, certainly to have more health consultants would not be a bad thing, or optometrists or other type of healthcare services within the store. So, I mean, that's obvious. But if we look at the Best Buy model, where Best Buy wins is the fact that they now have in-home services that you can engage with inside the store. So it's really a 360-degree offering of the type of products that you specialize in. So But I do want to turn this question over to you because I'm certain that the RNG perspective would be maybe a little bit different than what we have here in GMDC.
Yeah, I mentioned right at the beginning that as you just reiterated, Mark, the obvious one that we've seen take space is those healthcare trends and those healthcare services, not even just at CVS and Walgreens, but you see that pretty much across retail. For everybody, if you want to go see a store that is really one of the ones that we point to as a good example for services, it actually comes from the pet care category. Look at PetSmart's new store that they've called sort of their Amazon proof store that we highlighted during the experiential webinar for GMDC a few weeks ago. And you have a mix of health services, you have a mix of grooming services. It really is about finding the experiences that shoppers want to engage in, as Mark said, on a localized level. So if you're more of a food store, you're seeing what we sort of narrow that down to say is the trip that the shopper is going to engage in will become more of a leisure-driven activity. Need-based shopping will continue to shift online. So the question really becomes, what activities do we do outside of the store that would make sense from a proximity standpoint to engage with in the store? So obviously health was one of them. For grocers, obviously nutrition and cooking classes and some of those activities are another one. But there's a reason you see so much growth within food service, because that combines the elements of the social interaction with some of the authority that the retailer already has, which is why you see retailers like Kroger opening not even a grocery store, not even pretending to have a grocery operation. It is a purely dedicated restaurant. And there'll be more of that natural evolution into more of those services, just to capture a greater spend of that overall shopper's wallet.
Good. Mike, thanks again for your partnership and for your membership and support on our Education and Leadership Council through Planet Retail. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for joining. I hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon.
Well, we appreciate the insights in today's presentation. Also, please know that all of these insights drive action towards our GMDC members. And there's a wealth more of information available not only on our website, but really behind the curtain in our member-only area that you can pick up other next practice reports. If this is your first time experiencing a GMDC Infocast, I'd like to make sure that you're aware that this session and all previous Infocast events can be viewed in the archive tab on gmdcconnect.org, along with the schedule to register for future ones. I'd also like to encourage you to get involved with GMDC if you're not already a member. Today's Infocast is a small sample of what you have access to. GMDC is a business ecosystem that helps you connect, collaborate, create, and enable commerce in both the general merchandise and health, beauty, wellness industry. For more information, please contact me at markm@gmdc.org. I'd love to help you find opportunities to get your company exposed and connected to high-profile executives that can truly change your business. Thanks for joining us today.